They called her a leech. They called her a nobody. For 6 years, the Sterling family treated Genevieve like a stain on their pristine reputation, waiting for the day they could finally throw her out on the street. And when that day came, inside a cold, glass-walled boardroom on the 45th floor, they didn't just smile, they laughed. They laughed because she signed the papers without asking for a single penny. They thought they had won. They thought she was broken. But they didn't check who owned the private airfield their company jet was trying to land on 3 weeks later. They didn't know that the woman they just discarded wasn't losing a husband, she was acquiring a target. This is the story of how the silence became louder than their laughter ever was. The air inside the conference room of Sterling and Halloway smelled of expensive espresso and predatory intent. It was raining over Seattle, a gray, miserable drizzle that streaked the floor-to-ceiling windows, but inside, the atmosphere was electric with triumph. Richard Sterling sat at the head of the table, leaning back in his Herman Miller chair, spinning his wedding band on the polished mahogany surface. He watched the ring wobble and fall flat, a perfect metaphor for his marriage, he thought. Across from him sat Genevieve. She looked small in the oversized leather chair. She was wearing a simple beige cardigan that had seen better days, her hair pulled back in a messy bun that Richard's mother, Beatrice, had often referred to as the waitress look. "Well?" Beatrice Sterling barked from the corner of the room. She was sipping champagne, despite it being 10 a.m. on a Tuesday. Is she going to sign, or does she need a dictionary to understand the big words? Richard chuckled, a low, throaty sound that lacked any warmth. "Easy, Mother. Let her read it. I want her to be fully aware that she's leaving with exactly what she came in with. Nothing." Arthur Pendleton, the family's longtime attorney, a man with a smile like a shark, slid the document across the table. It was thick, over 50 pages of legal jargon designed to intimidate. To summarize, "Mrs. Sterling," Arthur said, his voice dripping with faux sympathy, "the prenuptial agreement is ironclad. However, Richard is generous. He is willing to offer a one-time relocation fee of $5,000. In exchange, you waive all rights to alimony, spousal support, and any claim on the Sterling Tech shares. You also agree to a non-disclosure agreement effective immediately." Genevieve didn't look up. Her eyes were fixed on the paper. She hadn't spoken a word since entering the room. "5,000?" Beatrice scoffed, walking over to the window to look down at the city she felt she owned. "That's too much, Richard. She'll only spend it on cheap clothes and bad decisions. That's how people like her are." Richard sighed, checking his Rolex. "Just sign it, General, please. I have a merger meeting with the Rossini Group in an hour. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. You had a good run. You lived in my house, ate my food, wore the jewelry I bought you. The ride is over." Genevieve finally looked up. Her eyes were dry. There was no redness, no puffiness. There was a calmness in her expression that Richard found slightly unsettling, though he quickly dismissed it as shock. "I don't want the 5,000, Genevieve said softly. The room went silent. Beatrice whipped around. "Excuse me? You want more? You ungrateful little—" "I don't want any money," Genevieve interrupted, her voice steady. "I will sign the divorce papers. I will sign the NDA. I will waive all claims to the Sterling fortune. I only want one thing." Richard raised an eyebrow. "And what is that? The Audi? The jewelry? Keep it. It's used goods anyway." "No," Genevieve said. She reached into her purse, a worn canvas tote bag, and pulled out a small, folded photograph. It was a picture of the old, dilapidated greenhouse on the far edge of the Sterling estate. It was a rotting structure, filled with weeds, that the gardener used to store fertilizer. "I want the deed to the old greenhouse on the north acre, and the quarter-acre of rocky land it sits on. That's it." The silence in the room stretched for a solid 10 seconds before Beatrice exploded into laughter. It wasn't a polite laugh. It was a cackle. She doubled over, clutching her pearls. "The greenhouse?" Beatrice wheezed. "The shack? Richard, she wants the shack." Richard smirked, shaking his head. "Jen, That thing is a hazard. We were going to bulldoze it next month to build a new garage for the Ferraris. Why on earth would you want that? Sentimental value, Genevieve said simply. I spent a lot of time there when you were working late. Working late was a generous euphemism for Richard's notorious affairs, which everyone in the room knew about, including Arthur the lawyer. Richard shrugged. Arthur, can we do that? Carve out that scrap of land? Arthur flipped through a file. It's irregular, but the land value there is negligible. It's mostly shale and rock. Strictly speaking, it would cost you more to demolish the structure than to gift it to her. If she takes the land, she takes the tax liability too. Done, Richard said, sliding the pen toward her. Take the dirt, General. Build a castle of mud for all I care. Genevieve picked up the pen. It was a heavy, gold-plated Mont Blanc that Richard had received as a gift from a senator. She didn't hesitate. She flipped to the back page. Scritch, scratch. The sound of the pen on paper was the only noise in the room. Genevieve A. Sterling. She capped the pen and set it down gently. Then, she reached into her tote bag again and pulled out her wedding ring, a 3-carat diamond that Richard had picked out from a catalog in 5 minutes. She placed it on top of the signed papers. You're free, Richard, she said. She stood up, smoothing down her cardigan. That's it? Richard asked, almost disappointed. He had expected begging. He had expected screaming. He had wanted her to cry so he could feel powerful, so he could feel justified in trading her in for the younger model he was meeting for lunch. That's it, she replied. As she turned to leave, Beatrice stepped in her path. The older woman was shorter than Genevieve, but carried herself with the bulk of her bank account. She leaned in close, smelling of expensive perfume and rot. Don't you dare come back crawling when you realize you can't pay rent, Beatrice hissed. You were a mistake, Genevieve. A charity case. We're all laughing at you. You know that, right? The whole city knows you're walking away with nothing but dirt. Genevieve looked down at Beatrice. For a split second, a flicker of something dangerous crossed Genevieve's eyes, a cold, steel-blue sharpness that Beatrice had never seen before. It was the look of a wolf deciding if a rabbit was worth the energy to kill. Goodbye, Beatrice, Genevieve said. Enjoy the merger. She walked out the heavy oak doors. Inside the room, the laughter erupted again. Richard popped the cork on a new bottle of Dom Perignon. To freedom, Richard shouted, raising his glass. To getting rid of the trash, Beatrice cheered. Arthur the lawyer smiled, but he was frowning internally as he looked at the signature on the papers. Genevieve A. Sterling. He paused. He realized after 6 years he didn't actually know what the A stood for. He shrugged. It didn't matter. She was nobody. Genevieve walked out of the Sterling and Halloway building and into the Seattle rain. She didn't open an umbrella. She let the cold water hit her face, washing away the stifling atmosphere of the boardroom. She walked 2 blocks, turning the corner onto a quiet side street where a black sedan was waiting. It wasn't a taxi. It was a Mercedes Maybach S-Class with tinted windows so dark they looked like oil slicks. The driver, a man with shoulders the size of a refrigerator and a scar running down his neck, stepped out instantly. He held a large black umbrella over her head. Mrs. Sterling? The driver asked. Genevieve stopped him with a sharp look. She reached up and pulled the hair tie out of her bun. Her long, dark hair cascaded down her shoulders, instantly changing her silhouette. She took off the beige cardigan and dropped it into a nearby trash can. Underneath, she wore a black silk blouse that screamed understated power. Not Sterling, Cale. Never Sterling again, she said. Her voice was different now. The softness was gone. The hesitation was deleted. It was a voice that commanded armies. It's Caldwell. Genevieve Caldwell. Apologies, Miss Caldwell, Cale said, opening the rear door. We have the secure line ready. Genevieve slid into the back seat. The interior was warm, smelling of fresh leather and ozone. She picked up a tablet that was waiting for her on the center console. On the screen was a live feed of the stock market, specifically tracking Sterling Tech. She pressed a button on the intercom. Connect me to Zurich. A moment later, a voice filled the cabin. It was a man, sounding elderly but sharp. Genevieve, is it done? It's done, Hans, she said, watching the rain streak the window. I signed. I waived everything. They think I'm destitute. And the asset? Hans asked. Secured, she replied. I own the greenhouse and the underlying geological survey rights for Sector 4 North. They have no idea? Richard thinks geology is something you buy at a jewelry store. He has no idea what's sitting under that rock, Genevieve said, a small, terrifying smile touching her lips. Initiate Phase 2. I want all my assets unfrozen. Transfer the holding titles from the shell companies back to the Caldwell Trust. And Hans? Yes, madame? Get the jet ready. I have business in London. If Richard is trying to merge with the Rossini Group, he's going to need a venue for the signing. I want to make sure we're available to host. Understood. Welcome back, Ghost. The line clicked dead. Genevieve leaned back and closed her eyes. For 6 years, she had played the role of the doting, simple wife. She had met Richard in a coffee shop, pretending to be a struggling freelance artist. She had wanted to know if a man could love her for her, not for the Caldwell name, a name that, in the circles of high finance, carried more weight than Sterling ever could. The Caldwells didn't just own tech companies. They owned the banks that loaned the tech companies money. They were the old money that made the new money tremble. But Richard hadn't loved her. He had loved possessing her. He had loved having a pretty, quiet thing to put on a shelf. And when she didn't help his social climbing, he discarded her. He had failed the test. Now, the test was over. The lesson was about to begin. 2 weeks passed. Life for Richard Sterling was a blur of parties and press releases. The divorce news had been buried under the headlines of his upcoming merger with the Rossini Group, an Italian conglomerate that would triple Sterling Tech's valuation. We need a venue for the final signing, Richard shouted over the noise of a helicopter as he landed in the Hamptons. Something big, something that screams power. We tried the Ritz in Paris. They're booked, his assistant, a nervous young man named Timothy, stammered. We tried the Burj Al Arab, booked. Well, find something, Richard yelled. What about that private estate in the Swiss Alps? The Sky Vault? The Rossinis love privacy. Timothy looked at his iPad. The Sky Vault. It's extremely exclusive, sir. It's owned by a private holding company called Ethelgard. They rarely rent it out. Offer them double, Richard said, adjusting his sunglasses. I don't care who owns it. Just get us in there. Beatrice wants the photos to look spectacular. Timothy made the call. Surprisingly, the approval came through within the hour. The price was exorbitant, $500,000 for a 3-day rental. But Richard didn't care. He signed the check with a flourish. See? Richard bragged to Beatrice that night over dinner. Money talks. The world opens doors when you're a Sterling. Beatrice nodded, swirling her wine. Have you heard from her? The leech? Genevieve? Richard laughed. Not a peep. Probably living in that shack, eating beans. Forget her, mother. We're going to Switzerland. They had no idea that the invoice for the rental of the Sky Vault didn't go to a bank. It went directly to a secure server sitting in the basement of a London townhouse. And they certainly didn't know that the owner of Ethelgard Holdings had personally approved the request, instructing the staff to prepare the special welcome package. Genevieve stood in her penthouse in London, looking out at the Thames. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Cale. Target is in motion. Sterling jet departs for Geneva in 48 hours. Genevieve typed back, prepare the G650. We land 30 minutes before them. She walked over to her closet. The beige cardigans were gone. In their place were rows of tailored suits, velvet gowns, and shoes with heels sharp enough to puncture a lung. She pulled out a dress, a deep, blood-red silk number. Time to go to work, she whispered. The game was afoot. The mouse was walking into the trap, convinced he was the lion. The approach to the Swiss Alps was less of a travel experience and more of an ascension into a different stratosphere of existence. Richard Sterling sat by the window of the chartered Gulfstream G550, watching the jagged white peaks of the mountains slice through the clouds below. He swirled his scotch, a 30-year-old Macallan that the flight attendant had poured with trembling hands and felt like a god. "Look at that, Mother," Richard said, pointing out the window. "Top of the world, exactly where we belong." Beatrice Sterling, however, was not looking at the view. She was busy inspecting the stitching on the leather seat of the private jet, looking for a flaw she could complain about. Finding none, she settled for complaining about the air pressure. "My ears are popping, Richard. Tell the pilot to fly lower," she snapped, adjusting her diamond brooch. "And this caviar is too salty. I told you we should have flown our own jet, not this rental. Our jet is undergoing maintenance, Mother. And besides," Richard smiled, checking his reflection in the dark window, "once we sign the Rossini deal tomorrow, we'll buy a bigger one. Maybe a Global 7500, something that can fly us to Tokyo without stopping for fuel." Arthur Pendleton, the lawyer, sat across from them, clutching his briefcase as if it contained a bomb. He was sweating, despite the climate-controlled cabin. He had a bad feeling about this trip. The contract for the venue rental had been strange, too easy, and the wire transfer instructions had routed through 3 different offshore entities before landing in a blind trust. But he hadn't told Richard that. Richard didn't like details. He only liked results. "We're beginning our descent into a private airfield outside of Gstaad," the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Please fasten your seatbelts." As the jet banked and touched down on the private runway, Richard looked out and saw another plane already parked on the tarmac. It was a monstrosity of luxury, a Bombardier Global 8000, painted in a matte black finish with no tail number visible, just a small, stylized crest in silver on the fuselage. It looked like a predator sleeping on the asphalt. "Who does that belong to?" Richard asked as they disembarked, buttoning his cashmere coat against the biting alpine wind. A ground crew member, a man with a thick Swiss accent, took their luggage. "That, Monsieur Sterling, belongs to the owner of the Sky Vault. She arrived last night to ensure the estate was prepared for your arrival." "She?" Beatrice perked up. "A woman owns this place? Who is she? A widow? An actress?" The ground crew member merely smiled, a tight, professional expression that gave nothing away. "The owner values her privacy above all else. Madame, please, the cars are waiting." The cars were 3 matching Rolls-Royce Cullinans, engines idling silently. The drive up the mountain took 40 minutes, winding through snow-covered forests and treacherous switchbacks. The higher they went, the more isolated it became. There were no other houses, no ski lifts, no signs of civilization, just rock, ice, and money. Then, the Sky Vault appeared. It was an architectural marvel, or perhaps an act of violence against nature, a massive structure of steel and reinforced glass, cantilevered over the edge of a sheer cliff drop. It didn't look like a house. It looked like a Bond villain's fortress. The entire front facade was glass, offering a panoramic view of the valley 3,000 feet below. "Impressive," Richard muttered, finally feeling a twinge of intimidation. "How much is this place worth?" "Price is irrelevant for something like this," Arthur whispered, staring up at the structure. "You couldn't build this today. The zoning laws alone would be impossible to bypass." They were greeted at the massive slate doors by a house manager named Elias, a tall, severe man in a tuxedo who looked like he could kill a man with a napkin. "Welcome to the Sky Vault," Elias said. His voice echoed in the cavernous entry hall. The floors were black marble, polished to a mirror shine. "The Rossini party has already arrived via helicopter. They are settling in the West Wing. You have been allocated the East Wing." "And the owner?" Beatrice asked, looking around the vast, empty hall. "Will we be meeting her? I'd like to thank her for the adequate accommodations." "The owner is currently indisposed," Elias said smoothly. "She will join you for the signing ceremony tomorrow morning in the Obsidian Room. Until then, you have the run of the house. Dinner will be served at 8 p.m. The chef has prepared a tasting menu." Richard felt a strange prickle on the back of his neck. The house was quiet, too quiet. It felt less like a hotel and more like a chessboard where the pieces had already been set. He shook it off. "You're Richard Sterling," he told himself. "You're the CEO of a multi-million-dollar tech empire. You're about to close the deal of the decade. Let's get changed, Richard said, clapping his hands. I want to look sharp for the Rossinis. We need to project dominance. Dinner that night was a tense affair. The dining room was a long, narrow space with a glass floor that looked directly down into the abyss of the canyon below. It was designed to make guests feel unmoored, vulnerable. Giovanni Rossini, the patriarch of the Italian conglomerate, sat opposite Richard. Giovanni was a man of 60, carved from olive wood and skepticism. He smoked a cigar at the table, ignoring the non-smoking signs. His brother, Luca, sat beside him, tapping away on a tablet. This place, Giovanni said, gesturing with his cigar, it is theatrical. I did not know you had such taste, Richard. I thought Americans preferred gold toilets and trumpets. Richard laughed nervously. We wanted to honor the magnitude of our partnership, Giovanni. Sterling Tech and Rossini Group. It's a marriage of giants. It deserves a palace. A marriage, Giovanni mused. Yes. Speaking of marriage, my lawyers tell me your divorce was finalized 2 weeks ago. This will not impact the stock price? No messy alimony battles? None at all, Richard said quickly, taking a sip of wine. He paused. The wine was excellent, but distinct. It was a 1982 Chateau Margaux. He frowned. That was Genevieve's favorite vintage. She used to talk about it, back when she pretended to know about wine. He pushed the thought away. Coincidence. My ex-wife was reasonable, Richard continued. She signed everything away. A clean break. She walked away with nothing. I retained full control of the company assets. You have nothing to worry about. Beatrice chimed in, cutting a piece of veal with aggressive precision. The girl was a nobody, Mr. Rossini. A waitress Richard picked up in a moment of weakness. She had no head for business, no spine. We gave her a few dollars, and she scurried off back to the gutter. Giovanni's eyes narrowed slightly. He exchanged a look with Luca. I see. You crushed her then? We negotiated, Richard corrected, puffing out his chest. I win. That's what I do. Interesting, Luca spoke up, looking up from his tablet. Because the market chatter is strange today. Someone is buying up large blocks of rare earth mineral futures, specifically lithium and cobalt deposits in the Pacific Northwest. It's driving the cost of your manufacturing supply chain up by 12% since this morning. Richard blinked. Market fluctuation. It happens. We have stockpiles. We hope so, Giovanni said, extinguishing his cigar in a crystal ashtray. Because if we sign tomorrow and your supply chain costs skyrocket, the valuation of Sterling Tech drops, and I do not like buying falling knives. It's fine, Richard insisted, though sweat was beginning to bead on his forehead. Tomorrow, we sign, we merge, and we become untouchable. From the shadows of the mezzanine level above, unseen by the diners, a figure watched. She stood in the darkness, wearing a black velvet robe. She held a glass of 1982 Chateau Margaux. Genevieve watched Richard sweat. She watched Beatrice preen. She watched the Rossinis circle like sharks. Eat up, Richard, she whispered, into the silence of the empty hallway. It's your last supper. She turned and walked soundlessly back to the master suite, the one room in the house that was off-limits to the guests. Inside, 3 monitors were glowing. One showed the live feed of the dining room. The second showed the stock market, specifically the rising price of the mineral rights associated with a certain worthless greenhouse. And the third monitor showed a dossier. The title of the file was Rossini Group, Hidden Liabilities and Leverage. Genevieve didn't just plan to ruin Richard. She planned to own the entire table. The next morning, the sun did not rise over the sky vault. Instead, a thick, heavy fog rolled in, wrapping the glass house in a shroud of white. Visibility was 0. It felt as if the house was floating in a void. The signing was scheduled for 9 a.m. in the Obsidian Room, a conference space named for its walls of black volcanic stone. A single, massive table made of a slab of petrified wood dominated the center. Richard arrived first, pacing the length of the room. He was wearing his power suit, a bespoke navy brioni. But underneath the fine wool, his skin felt clammy. He hadn't slept well. He had dreamt of the greenhouse. In the dream, the greenhouse wasn't empty. It was filled with vines that wrapped around his throat. Beatrice entered next, looking haggard but heavily made up. "This fog is depressing," she complained. "Where is the coffee?" Arthur Pendleton was arranging documents on the table. His hands were shaking visibly now. "Richard," he hissed, "I checked the deed transfer on the greenhouse again this morning, just to be sure the tax liability was gone." "And?" Richard snapped. "Why are we talking about that damn shack now?" "Because," Arthur swallowed hard, "I can't find the record of the demolition order, and the new owner, listed on the county registry. It isn't Genevieve Sterling." "Well, who is it?" "It's a holding company. Gaia Sovereignty." "So she sold it already?" Richard laughed. "Good for her. Maybe she got 10 grand for it." "Who cares, Arthur? The Rossinis are coming." The double doors opened, and the Rossini brothers entered. They did not look happy. Luca was holding a thick folder. "Gentlemen," Richard said, putting on his best smile, "ready to make history?" Giovanni didn't smile. He walked to the table and threw the folder down. It landed with a heavy thud. "We have a problem, Richard," Giovanni said. His voice was low, dangerous. "Problem? What problem?" "The papers are ready." "The problem," Luca said, "is that we ran a final due diligence check on your supply chain this morning. Your primary source, for the silica, required for your new microchip. The chip that is the centerpiece of this merger comes from a quarry in Sector 4 North." Richard frowned. "Yes, we've mined that sector for years. It's part of the estate." "No," Giovanni said. "It was part of the estate, but according to the new survey maps, released an hour ago, the access road and the primary deposit shelf sit on a quarter-acre plot of land that was carved out of the estate 2 weeks ago." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. "The greenhouse?" "The land under the greenhouse," Luca corrected. "Whoever owns that plot of land controls the access to the mine. They put up a gate this morning. A literal gate, Richard. Your trucks are backed up for 5 miles. You can't get the silica out. Without the silica, you can't make the chips. Without the chips, your company is worth half of what we agreed to pay." "That's impossible," Richard stammered. "It's just dirt. She told me it was just dirt." "She?" Giovanni raised an eyebrow. "Who is she?" "My ex-wife. I gave it to her," Richard yelled, slamming his hand on the table. "She tricked me, but it doesn't matter. I'll call her. I'll offer her $10,000. She'll open the gate. She's desperate." "I doubt that," a voice rang out. It wasn't Giovanni. It wasn't Luca. The voice came from the top of the spiral staircase that led to the owner's private loft. The entire room turned. Genevieve stood at the top of the stairs. But this was not the Genevieve Richard knew. The messy bun was gone, replaced by a sleek, sharp bob that framed her face like a helmet of war. The beige cardigan was a distant memory. She wore a white structural suit that looked like it had been tailored by a laser. On her wrist was a Patek Philippe that cost more than Richard's car. Her posture was erect, commanding, terrifying. She descended the stairs slowly, the click of her heels echoing like gunshots in the silent room. Richard's mouth fell open. Beatrice dropped her purse. "Genevieve?" Richard whispered. What are you doing here? Did you break in?" "Security." He looked around for Elias, the house manager. Elias was standing by the door. He didn't move to help Richard. Instead, he bowed his head slightly as Genevieve passed him. "Good morning, Miss Caldwell," Elias said, respectfully. "Thank you, Elias," she replied, her voice cool and crisp. She walked to the head of the table, the seat Richard had been aiming for, and sat down. She didn't look at Richard. She looked at Giovanni. "Signor Rossini," Genevieve said, switching to flawless Italian. "Mi dispiace per l'attesa. Spero che l'alloggio sia di vostro gradimento. I apologize for the wait. I hope the accommodations are to your liking." Giovanni Rossini looked at her, his eyes widening in shock. Then, recognition dawned on his face. He stood up abruptly, buttoning his jacket out of respect. "Caldwell?" Giovanni gasped. "Genevieve Caldwell? As in the Caldwell Trust?" The Zurich Group? My father was James Caldwell, Genevieve said calmly. I believe his bank financed your first expansion into Asia in 1998. Giovanni looked like he had seen a ghost. In the world of high finance, the Sterlings were millionaires. The Caldwells were the people who printed the money. They were royalty. I had no idea, Giovanni stammered. We thought, Richard said. Richard says a lot of things, Genevieve said, finally turning her gaze to her ex-husband. Richard was trembling. His brain couldn't process the image in front of him. Jen? What is this? Caldwell? You told me your parents were teachers in Ohio? They were, Genevieve said, her voice devoid of emotion. After they retired from running the global economy, they taught economics at a university because they enjoyed it. You never asked about them, Richard. In 6 years, you never once asked to meet them. You were too busy talking about yourself. But the waitress, the coffee shop. I was doing a thesis on the behavior of the nouveau riche, Genevieve said, a small, cruel smile playing on her lips. I wanted to see if a man like you could love a woman who had nothing. You failed the experiment, Richard. Beatrice stepped forward, her face purple with rage. This is fraud. You lied to us. You signed a prenup under false pretenses. I signed the prenup as Genevieve A. Sterling, she replied. The A stands for my middle name, Anne, my legal name. I never lied. I just didn't elaborate, and you were too busy laughing to check my background. She slid a folder across the table toward the Rossinis. Gentlemen, Genevieve addressed the Italians. You are about to merge with a company that has just lost its primary supply chain. I own the land blocking the mine, and I have no intention of opening that gate. Sterling Tech will be unable to fulfill its orders within 48 hours. Their stock will plummet. Giovanni looked at the folder, then at Richard. The look of disgust on his face was absolute. However, Genevieve continued, my holding company, Gaia Sovereignty, is willing to acquire Sterling Tech for pennies on the dollar, of course. Once I own it, I will reopen the mine. If the Rossini Group wishes to partner with me, I am open to discussion. Giovanni didn't hesitate. He looked at Richard. The deal is off, Sterling. You can't do this, Richard screamed. He lunged toward the table, grabbing the papers. We have a verbal agreement. I'll sue. Sit down, Richard, Genevieve said. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. The authority in her voice slammed him back into his chair. You have two choices, Genevieve said, leaning forward. Option A, the Rossinis walk away. I keep the gate closed. Your company goes bankrupt in a month. The board fires you. You lose everything, including this house in Seattle that you put up as collateral for your last loan, which, by the way, my bank now holds. Richard's eyes bulged. You bought my mortgage? I bought your debt, Richard. All of it. And option B? Arthur squeaked, looking like he was about to faint. Option B, Genevieve said. You sign Sterling Tech over to me right now. I will give you a severance package. She pulled a single sheet of paper from her portfolio and slid it to him. Richard looked at it. His hands shook so hard, the paper rattled. $5,000? Richard whispered. It's a generous relocation fee, Genevieve quoted his own words back to him. Take it, Richard, or I will bury you under so many lawsuits, you'll be spending that $5,000 on bail money. Beatrice began to sob. It was a dry, heaving sound of total defeat. You're a monster, Richard whispered, tears leaking from his eyes. I took you in. I gave you a home. You gave me a cage, Genevieve corrected. She uncapped the Cartier pen, her own pen this time, and held it out. Sign the papers, Richard. The jet is waiting to take you home. Economy class. The silence in the room was deafening. The only sound was the wind, howling against the glass walls of the sky vault, and the scratching of a pen as Richard Sterling signed his empire away to the woman he had laughed at 2 weeks ago. The laughter was gone. Now, there was only the cold, hard reality of the silence. The descent from the Swiss Alps was not the triumphant procession Richard Sterling had envisioned just 48 hours prior. It was an evacuation. Elias, the stoic house manager of the Sky Vault, had informed them that the private car service was no longer available for their use. Instead, a local taxi, a battered station wagon, smelling faintly of wet dog and diesel, was summoned to take them down the mountain. Beatrice refused to speak. She sat in the back seat, clutching her crocodile skin handbag as if it were a life preserver in a stormy sea. Her face was pale, her makeup smudged from the tears she had shed in the foyer while Genevieve watched from the balcony. Every bump in the road sent a jolt of misery through her spine, a physical reminder of their sudden, violent fall from grace. Richard sat in the front seat, staring blankly at the snow-covered pines blurring past. His phone was buzzing incessantly in his pocket. Notifications, emails, alerts. He didn't check them. He knew what they were. The news cycle moved faster than light, and Genevieve, or rather, the Caldwell machine, would not have wasted a second. They arrived at the airport, not at the private terminal, but at the main commercial entrance. "Where are we going?" Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling as she looked at the throngs of tourists, dragging suitcases through the slush. "We don't have tickets, Richard." "We have e-tickets," Richard muttered, pulling up his phone. Genevieve's assistant emailed them to me. "Economy, row 42, middle and window." "I will not sit in the middle," Beatrice hissed, a spark of her old arrogance flaring up before dying out instantly. "I can't breathe back there." "You have no choice, Mother," Richard snapped, causing the taxi driver to glance over with annoyance. "We have no money. Do you understand? The credit cards are frozen. The company accounts are locked. We have $5,000 in a check. I can't even cash until we get to a U.S. bank. We are riding in row 42, and you will be grateful we aren't swimming across the Atlantic." The flight was a 9-hour purgatory. Richard sat wedged between a backpacking student who smelled of patchouli and his mother, who wept silently into a paper napkin. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Genevieve. Not the Genevieve in the white suit, the titan who had crushed him, but the Genevieve he had ignored for 6 years. He remembered her asking him to look at her paintings. "Not now, Jen. I'm busy." He remembered her asking if they could go for a walk in the gardens. "It's too cold. Jen, don't be childish." He remembered the way she used to look at him, with a hopefulness that slowly, over years, turned into a dull, flat acceptance. He realized now, with a sickening lurch of his stomach, that he had never known her. He had lived with a stranger for 6 years, a stranger who had been patiently, meticulously taking notes. Seattle was raining when they landed. It was fitting. They took a rideshare app car to the Sterling estate in Medina. As the car approached the massive iron gates, Richard felt a small glimmer of relief. At least they had the house. The mansion was his sanctuary. He could hide there, regroup, call his old contacts, maybe find a loophole. But as the car rounded the final bend, Richard saw the lights. Blue and red flashing lights. 2 police cruisers were parked in front of the gates, and beside them, a black van with the logo of a private security firm. Not the firm Richard used. "What is this?" Beatrice gasped. Richard jumped out of the car before it fully stopped. He ran toward the gate, but a uniformed officer stepped in his path. "Sir, take a step back," the officer commanded. "This is my house," Richard yelled, rain plastering his hair to his forehead. "I live here. What is going on?" A man in a sharp gray suit stepped out of the black van. He held a clipboard. "Mr. Sterling?" the man asked. "Yes. Tell these officers to move." "I'm afraid I can't do that," the man said calmly. "I represent Caldwell Asset Management. As of 9 a.m. this morning, the mortgage on this property has been foreclosed due to violation of the lending terms." "Violation? I've never missed a payment." "Technically, you haven't," the man agreed. "But the loan agreement you signed 5 years ago had a change of control clause. It states that if your equity in Sterling Tech drops below 51%, the bank has the right to call the full value of the loan immediately. Since you signed over 100% of your shares this morning in Switzerland, the loan is due. Can you pay the remaining $12 million balance right now?" Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He felt like he had been punched in the gut. "I didn't think so," the man said, signaling to the movers who were now exiting the van. We are here to secure the assets. You are permitted to enter for 1 hour, supervised, to remove personal items, clothing, and toiletries only. No art, no jewelry, no electronics. Those are now property of the bank. You can't do this, Richard whispered. It's already done, sir. The locks have been changed. For the next hour, Richard and Beatrice shuffled through the marble halls of the home they had prided themselves on. They were shadowed by security guards who watched their every move. Beatrice tried to take her jewelry box. I'm sorry, ma'am, the guard said, gently but firmly taking it from her hands. Appraised assets stay. But this is my grandmother's necklace, she wailed. If you can provide proof of purchase or inheritance separate from the marital assets, you can file a claim in court, the guard recited. Until then, it stays. Richard went to his study. He looked at the empty shelves. He looked at the humidor where he kept his Cuban cigars. He didn't touch them. He walked to the desk and picked up a single, framed photo. It was a picture of him and Genevieve on their wedding day. She was smiling, a genuine, radiant smile. He looked bored, checking his watch. He smashed the photo on the floor. They left the mansion carrying 4 plastic trash bags of clothes. The rain was coming down harder now. They stood on the curb, the iron gates clanging shut behind them with a sound of finality that echoed in Richard's bones. Where do we go? Beatrice asked, her voice broken. She looked small, old, and frail in the rain. Richard looked at his mother. He looked at the wet pavement. I don't know, he said. Across town, at the headquarters of Sterling Tech, now rapidly being rebranded, the atmosphere was very different. The employees had heard the rumors. Panic had set in early in the morning. Was the company collapsing? Were they all fired? Who was Gaia Sovereignty? At 2 p.m., a convoy of black SUVs pulled up to the main entrance. Genevieve stepped out. She was wearing a trench coat over a navy dress, carrying nothing but a leather portfolio. She didn't look like a vengeful ex-wife. She looked like a CEO. She walked into the lobby, followed by a team of 10 lawyers and financial analysts. The receptionist, a young woman named Sarah, who had always been kind to Genevieve when she visited Richard, looked up in terror. Mrs. Sterling? Sarah stammered. Genevieve, please. She smiled warmly. It's good to see you, Sarah. How is your cat? Sarah blinked, confused by the humanity in the midst of the corporate raid. She's good. Glad to hear it. Please page the executive team. Conference room A. 5 minutes. Genevieve walked to the elevators. She didn't need a pass key. The security team had already remotely reprogrammed the building's access systems to her biometrics. Upstairs, the boardroom was filled with Richard's cronies, the CFO, the COO, the VP of sales. Men who had laughed at her jokes only when Richard did. Men who had ignored her presence for years. They stood up nervously as she entered. Sit, Genevieve commanded. They sat. By now, you have seen the press release, Genevieve began, pacing the head of the table. Richard Sterling is no longer associated with this company. I am the sole owner. Mrs. Sterling, the CFO, a man named Henderson, spoke up. With all due respect, the market is in free fall. Our stock is down 40% since the news broke. You have no experience running a tech company. We need to stabilize. I have a master's in international economics from the London School of Economics, Mr. Henderson, Genevieve said coolly. And while you were busy hiding losses in the Q3 report, yes, I know about the shell accounts in the Cayman Islands. I was restructuring the supply chain. Henderson turned white. The mine in Sector 4 North is open as of 10 minutes ago, Genevieve announced. The trucks are rolling. The silica supply is secured. Furthermore, the Rossini Group has agreed to a new deal. They aren't merging with us. They are licensing our technology. That means we keep our independence, and we keep the profits. The stock will recover by closing bell. A murmur of shock went through the room. She had fixed the crisis she created in less than a day. However, Genevieve continued, her voice hardening, there will be changes. This leadership team has been complicit in a culture of excess and negligence. You spent $3 million on corporate retreats last year, while freezing junior developer salaries. That ends today. She opened her portfolio. Mr. Henderson, Mr. Davids, Mr. Klein, your resignations are expected by the end of the hour. Security will escort you out. The rest of you have 1 month to prove you belong in my company. You can't fire us, Henderson shouted, standing up. We have contracts, golden parachutes. Read the morality clause in your contracts, Genevieve said, not even looking at him. Conduct detrimental to the company allows for termination with cause. I have the logs of the company jet. I know who you took to Cabo, Mr. Henderson, and I don't think your wife does. Henderson sat down. He looked like he was going to be sick. Leave, Genevieve said. As the men shuffled out, defeated and shamed, Genevieve walked to the window. It was the same window Beatrice had looked out of 2 weeks ago, mocking her. Genevieve looked down at the city. She didn't feel joy. She didn't feel a rush of dopamine. She felt a profound, quiet satisfaction. It was the feeling of a crooked picture frame finally being straightened. Hans, she said into her headset. Yes, madame? The voice of her trustee in Zurich crackled in her ear. It's done. We have control. Excellent. And Richard? He's in the wind. I suspect he'll go to the only place he has left. Shall I have him followed? No, Genevieve said, watching the rain wash the city clean. Let him be. Being Richard Sterling with no money is a worse punishment than anything I could invent. 3 months passed. The Pacific Northwest winter had settled in, a blanket of gray sky and relentless drizzle. In a cramped, mildew-scented studio apartment in the Rainier Valley, Richard Sterling sat on a futon. The fall had been absolute. He had applied for executive roles, consulting gigs, even a floor manager position at a car dealership. The answer was always the same. No one wanted to hire the man who had signed away a billion-dollar empire for $5,000. While Richard had become a global punchline, a meme of arrogance and failure, Genevieve was the media's new darling. She was on the cover of Forbes, hailed as the icon of the silent takeover. In the silence of that depressing apartment, the arrogance that had defined Richard's life began to rot away. Beatrice had fled to Ohio, leaving him truly alone. He looked at his reflection in the dirty window. He looked old, he looked tired, but for the first time, he looked real. He put on his coat, the only expensive item he had left, and walked out into the rain. He walked for 3 hours, all the way to the headquarters of what was now Caldwell Sterling. He didn't expect to get in, but when he buzzed the gate, the intercom crackled. Miss Caldwell says you can come up. 5 minutes. The building felt different. The sterile corporate atmosphere was gone, replaced by vibrant art and happy employees. When Richard entered the top-floor office, he saw Genevieve sitting at a sleek glass table surrounded by lush plants. Her office looked like a greenhouse. Richard stood in the doorway, dripping wet. He felt ashamed, but he held his ground. I didn't come to beg, Richard said hoarsely. I came to say, you were right. Genevieve raised an eyebrow. About what? The greenhouse, Richard said, a sad smile touching his lips. It wasn't just dirt. It was potential. I looked at it and saw a shack. You looked at it and saw the future. He took a step forward, his hands open, and I looked at you and saw a trophy. I didn't see the person. I was so busy trying to be important that I missed the most important thing in my life. You win, General, and you deserve it. Genevieve studied him. She saw the wet coat, the tired eyes, the slump of his shoulders. She saw the man she had once loved, finally stripped of his armor. Thank you, Richard, she said softly. That means something. What happens now? He asked. I keep building, she replied, turning to the window. And you? You keep walking. Find out who you are when you aren't a Sterling. Maybe you'll find out you're actually a decent person, but you have to do it alone. Richard nodded. He knew she was right. There was no rescue coming. Goodbye, Genevieve. He turned and walked out. As he exited the building, the rain stopped. The clouds broke, revealing a sliver of pale blue sky. He had nothing. He had no car, no home, no wife, no company. He touched his pocket. He had a subway card and $10. Richard Sterling took a deep breath of the cold, clean air. For the first time in 6 years, he didn't have to pretend to be a god. He was just a man. And strangely, terrifyingly, he felt free. 5 years later, the setting was the World Economic Forum in Davos. Genevieve returned to the Swiss Alps, not as a conqueror, but as an icon. Inside the main hall, world leaders sat shoulder to shoulder. Genevieve stood at the podium, wearing midnight blue velvet, her silver-streaked hair gleaming under the spotlight. Years ago, she began, her voice steady, I was offered a settlement. I was told my value was exactly $5,000. I was a liability to be discarded. Thousands of miles away, in a cluttered break room in an Ohio logistics warehouse, a man watched the live stream on a cracked iPhone. Richard Sterling adjusted his glasses. He was wearing a gray polo shirt with a name tag that read, Warehouse Manager. The tan was gone. The arrogance was gone. He looked tired, but for the first time in his life, he looked real. I took that $5,000, Genevieve told the world. I framed the check. It sat on my desk as a reminder of the cost of underestimating silence. That money was the seed capital for the Sterling Caldwell Initiative. We have used it to turn discarded women into CEOs and leaders. She looked directly into the camera. So, to the person who signed this check, thank you. You didn't break me. You funded me. Richard stared at the screen. A strange, heavy mixture of regret and pride washed over him. She had taken his worst moment and turned it into a legacy. He clicked off the phone as his foreman yelled for him to sign a manifest. Richard stood up. He was nobody now. He drove a 10-year-old Honda and ate tuna sandwiches, but he was finally an honest man. The final twist, the flower in the snow. The story ended where it began, at the greenhouse. A week later, Genevieve stood inside the glass structure on the old Sterling estate. It was no longer a rotting shack. She had restored it to a humid, thriving sanctuary. Mrs. Caldwell, Cale, her head of security, stepped in. The press is asking for a statement. Beatrice Sterling passed away this morning in the nursing home. Genevieve paused, looking at the rows of plants. Send lilies and pay for the funeral anonymously. It's not kindness, Cale. It's closure. She turned her attention to the center of the room. Under a grow light stood a single, magnificent orchid. It was a deep, iridescent purple with veins of gold. Do you know what this is? She asked. A flower? This is the Sterling Aeterna, she whispered. Richard's father was a botanist. He spent 20 years breeding this specific hybrid. He died before it bloomed, leaving the seeds in a jar, right here. She touched a petal gently. Richard thought this place was full of weeds. He sold it to me for nothing, because he was too busy building a garage for his Ferraris. But this flower produces a protein that regenerates nerve tissue. The patent alone is worth billions to the pharmaceutical industry. Kyle's eyes widened. And he never knew? He never looked, Genevieve said. He was standing on a gold mine of legacy and love, and he treated it like trash. She snipped the bloom and pinned it to her lapel. We're done here. Donate the land to the city for a park. The flower comes with me. It needs a better gardener. She walked out, leaving the door open. The silence of the estate was heavy, but it was no longer empty. It was the silence of a story that had finally been written. Genevieve didn't just win because she had money. She won because she paid attention. Richard lost everything, not because he was poor, but because he couldn't see the value in the small things, his wife, a dusty greenhouse, a father's legacy. He sold his future for a garage, proving that true poverty isn't a lack of money, but a lack of vision. If this story gave you chills, hit that like button. What would you have done in Genevieve's shoes? Saved Richard, or let him learn his lesson? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about how the silence eventually becomes the loudest sound on earth.